Kieran Blake had built her life on precision, discipline, and carefully controlled silence. At 33, she lived in a glass and steel penthouse overlooking Seattle's gray skyline, a space so minimalist it almost echoed, as if excess emotion had been deliberately designed out of it. Her company consumed most of her waking hours, and when she returned home, she usually did so alone, grateful for the quiet. The only constant presence in that space was Indy Torres. Indy arrived every weekday morning with soft footsteps and an unshakable warmth, filling the apartment with a kind of gentle energy Kieran pretended not to notice. Indy hummed while she cleaned, left handwritten notes tucked beside the coffee machine or taped discreetly to the fridge, small messages wishing her a good day, reminding her to eat, occasionally paired with a doodle that made no sense and yet somehow made Kieran smile. Kieran never commented on them. She told herself they were irrelevant. Still, she always read them. That Friday, Kieran came home earlier than usual, her mind heavy from a board meeting that had drained her more than she cared to admit. The apartment lights were on, and that alone was strange. Then she heard it, a quiet, broken sound that stopped her mid-step. Crying. She followed the sound into the kitchen and froze. Indy was sitting on the floor, back against the cabinet, knees pulled to her chest. She was still wearing a soft blue dress, elegant but modest, clearly chosen with care. Her makeup was smeared, mascara tracing dark lines down her cheeks. A cracked phone lay abandoned beside her hand. For a moment, Kieran simply stared, her chest tightening with something sharp and unfamiliar. "Indy?" she said, her voice gentler than she intended. Indy startled, immediately swiping at her face as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. I shouldn't be here anymore. I just needed a minute." Kieran dropped her bag without thinking and knelt in front of her, the marble floor cold against her knees. Indy looked at her in surprise, as if amused to seeing Kieran this close, this unguarded. "Tell me what happened," Kieran said, softly but firmly, as if it were not a request but a promise. Indy hesitated, then exhaled shakily. The story came out in fragments at first. The blind date her friends had insisted on, the restaurant, the woman who barely looked at her, the dismissive laughter when Indy spoke about studying graphic design at night. How the woman had called it a cute hobby. How she had left Indy alone with the bill, saying they clearly weren't compatible. "She said I was too ordinary," Indy whispered, her voice breaking. "That women like me don't really know what we want." The words hit Kieran like a physical blow. Something inside her fractured, then ignited. She had spent years surrounded by people who spoke casually about worth and ambition, never realizing how cruel those words could be when aimed at someone who was quietly doing everything they could to survive. "Put on your coat," Kieran said suddenly, standing. Indy blinked up at her. "What?" "Your coat," Kieran repeated. "We're going out." Indy shook her head weakly. "I don't think I can. She was wrong about you," Kieran interrupted, her voice steady but intense. "And I refuse to let you believe her. You deserve a real date. Let me fix this." Indy should have said no. She knew that. Kieran was her employer. This crossed lines that shouldn't even be acknowledged. But the way Kieran looked at her, fierce, protective, and unexpectedly vulnerable, made something warm bloom in her chest. She nodded. What followed felt unreal. The restaurant Kieran chose was elegant and softly lit, the kind of place Indy had only ever seen online. They were greeted immediately, seated without question. Kieran ordered wine without glancing at the price, her attention entirely on Indy. She listened as Indy spoke about her classes, her designs, her family back in Texas. She asked questions. Real ones. "You have more ambition than most people I know," Kieran said quietly. "You work, you study, you support others, and you still bring light into spaces that don't deserve you yet. Anyone who couldn't see, that didn't deserve to sit across from you." Indy flushed, her heart racing. "You read my notes?" she asked softly. Kieran met her gaze. "Every one of them," she admitted. "They're the best part of my day." After dinner, Kieran took her to a small private gallery, then for a walk along the harbor, sharing hot chocolate beneath the city lights. For the first time, Kieran spoke about loneliness, about how success sometimes felt hollow. Indy listened, her fingers brushing Kieran's sleeve when she spoke. At the apartment door near midnight, neither of them moved. The night felt heavy with possibility. "Thank you," Indy whispered, "for tonight. For making me feel like I matter." Kieran took her hand, her touch careful but electric. "This wasn't about fixing your night," she said. "This was the best date I've ever had. And I don't want it to be pretend." Indy's breath caught. The word impossible hovered between them, unspoken. "And now?" Indy asked. Kieran squeezed her hand. "Now you tell me if you're willing to risk something complicated. Because I already am." The morning after lingered between them like a held breath. Kieran woke earlier than usual, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom while the city outside remained gray and quiet, her mind replaying every moment from the night before. The way Indy's laughter had softened when she realized she was being taken seriously, the warmth of her hand in Kieran's, the fragile hope in her eyes at the door. For years, Kieran had built walls high enough to keep desire out. Now one night had cracked them open, and she didn't know how to close them again. When she stepped into the kitchen, the apartment was already awake in a different way. Coffee brewed. The faint smell of toast hung in the air. Indy stood by the counter, hair pulled back, dressed casually, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But when she turned and met Kieran's gaze, the air shifted. There was a hesitation there, a quiet awareness that made Kieran's chest tighten. "Good morning," Indy said, her voice soft, careful. "Morning," Kieran replied, then stopped, realizing how thin the word felt. They stood facing each other, both uncertain where to place their hands, their eyes, their emotions. Finally, Kieran broke the silence. "About last night," she began, then paused, choosing her words with unusual care. "I don't want to pretend it didn't matter." Indy nodded slowly. "Me neither. But I also don't want to wake up one day and realize it only mattered to me." The honesty landed gently, but firmly between them. Kieran exhaled. "That's exactly why we need to talk," she said. "About what this is. And what it can't be." Indy leaned back against the counter, folding her arms, not defensively, but protectively. "You're my employer," she said quietly. "That matters." "It does," Kieran agreed. "And I won't cross that line." The words cost her something, but she meant them. "If we're going to explore whatever this is, you can't work for me anymore." Indy's eyes widened. "Kieran, not because I want control," Kieran said quickly. "The opposite. I don't want you to ever wonder if what I feel is influenced by power or comfort. You deserve autonomy." Indy swallowed, conflicted. Working for Kieran paid her bills. It funded her classes. It gave her stability she couldn't afford to lose lightly. "I don't want to be rescued," she said after a moment. "I've worked hard to stand on my own." Kieran stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I know. And that's one of the things I admire most about you." The word admire settled warmly between them. Not desire. Not possession. Something steadier. They talked then, really talked, sitting at the kitchen table where Indy had cried only hours before. They spoke about boundaries, about fear, about how quickly emotions could grow when they'd been ignored for too long. Indy admitted she was terrified of becoming an experiment, something intense and brief that would fade once Kieran realized how inconvenient feelings could be. Kieran confessed that opening herself to someone felt like stepping into a room without exits. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly, "but I want to learn." Indy watched her, seeing not the powerful woman who owned the space around them, but someone earnest and uncertain. "Then maybe," Indy said slowly, "we don't rush. We don't label it. We just see each other as equals." Kieran smiled, small and genuine. "I can do slow," she said, surprising herself. That afternoon, Indy gathered her things, not in a dramatic goodbye, but in a gentle transition. Kieran insisted she take the rest of the week off, paid, no arguments allowed. At the door, they paused again, the echo of the night before undeniable. This time, Indy was the one who reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against Kieran's wrist.
"Dinner," she said.
"Tomorrow. Somewhere normal." Kieran's smile deepened. I'd like that. When the door closed behind Indy, the apartment felt quieter than ever, but not empty. Kieran stood alone in the kitchen, noticing the absence of notes on the fridge, the silence where humming usually lived. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like safety. It felt like waiting. The next day unfolded with an unfamiliar lightness that neither of them knew how to name. Kieran spent the morning distracted, rereading emails without absorbing their meaning, her thoughts drifting instead to the way Indy had said her name the night before, careful but warm, as if testing how it felt on her tongue. She told herself she was simply adjusting to change, that the quiet hum beneath her ribs was nothing more than anticipation, but she had never experienced anticipation like this, soft, steady, intimate. That evening, she chose a simple restaurant near the waterfront, unpretentious and warmly lit, a place where no one knew her and no one needed to. Indy arrived a few minutes late, breathless, cheeks flushed from the cold, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked impossibly soft. She smiled when she saw Kieran, not the polite smile she used out of habit, but something more open, more real. "Hi," Indy said. "Hi," Kieran replied, and felt the words settle differently than it ever had before. Dinner moved slowly, comfortably. They talked about small things at first, favorite meals, the city, Indy's classes, but beneath every exchange ran a quiet awareness of what they were doing, choosing to sit here together, choosing to keep going. Kieran found herself laughing more than she expected, listening not out of obligation but genuine interest. Indy spoke with her hands when she got excited, her eyes brightening when she talked about color theory, about how design could make people feel seen without saying a word. "You do that," Kieran said without thinking. Indy tilted her head. "Do what?" "Make people feel seen," Kieran said, meeting her gaze. The table fell briefly silent, not awkward, but full. After dinner, they walked along the water again, the city lights reflecting across the surface like scattered stars. The cold pushed them closer, shoulders brushing, then staying that way. Indy stopped at the railing, resting her elbows against it, and Kieran stood beside her, close enough to feel warmth through layers of clothing. "I keep waiting for this to feel strange," Indy admitted quietly. "And it doesn't." Kieran nodded. "It feels honest," she said. Indy glanced at her, searching. "You're not used to saying things like that." "No," Kieran agreed. "But I want to be." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Indy turned fully toward her then, their faces close, breath visible in the cold air. There was no rush, no sudden movement, just a shared pause, a moment where both understood what could happen next. Indy reached out first, her fingers brushing Kieran's sleeve, tentative, asking without words. Kieran didn't pull away. She covered Indy's hand with her own, grounding, deliberate. Their eyes met, and something gentle unfolded between them, something earned. The kiss, when it came, was slow and careful, a soft meeting of lips that held more promise than urgency. It lingered just long enough to confirm what they both already knew, then ended before it could tip into something reckless. They stayed close afterward, foreheads nearly touching, breathing in sync. "We should take this one step at a time," Indy murmured. Kieran smiled, her thumb brushing lightly against Indy's knuckles. "I don't want to skip a single step." Hey, if you're enjoying this story, go ahead and drop a like to help us grow even more. And let me know in the comments, on a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give this story so far? Your feedback makes all the difference. When they eventually parted, it was with reluctance and certainty intertwined. That night, as Kieran returned to her empty apartment, she noticed something new taped to the fridge, a small note in familiar handwriting, left earlier that day. It read simply, "Take a chance." She pressed her fingers against the paper, her heart steady and awake, knowing she already had. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar. Kieran found herself noticing time in a different way, not measured by meetings or deadlines, but by moments, messages exchanged late at night, the anticipation of seeing Indy again, the subtle comfort of knowing someone was thinking of her without needing anything in return. They didn't rush. They didn't pretend the kiss by the water had rewritten reality. Instead, they let it exist as a quiet truth between them. Indy spent her mornings at classes and freelance projects, her afternoons buried in design work at cafes around the city. Kieran returned to her routines with a sharper awareness, catching herself smiling at her phone when Indy sent photos of sketches or half-finished ideas, asking for opinions she didn't actually need. When they met again, it was unplanned and entirely domestic, Indy stopping by to pick up the last box of her things she'd left behind. The apartment felt different with her back in it, less polished, more alive. They moved around each other carefully, like two people learning a shared language. At one point, Indy laughed softly, holding up a mug she'd forgotten in a cabinet. "I guess I was more here than I realized," she said. Kieran watched her, a tenderness settling in her chest. "I noticed," she replied honestly. They sat on the couch afterward, not touching at first, talking about nothing important and everything that was. Indy spoke about a childhood memory of rearranging her room just to see how light changed a space. Kieran admitted she had never thought about her own space as something meant to comfort, only to function. Indy looked around the penthouse thoughtfully. "It could be both," she said. Without thinking, Kieran reached for Indy's hand, her fingers curling around hers with quiet certainty. Indy squeezed back, grounding. The contact stayed, unremarked, until it felt entirely natural. Later, they cooked together in the kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that surprised them both. Kieran chopped vegetables while Indy leaned against the counter, tasting sauces, teasing her gently about following recipes too precisely. "You don't trust improvisation," Indy said, smiling. "I'm learning," Kieran replied, meeting her gaze. The warmth between them thickened, not urgent but deep, like something settling into place. When Indy finally prepared to leave, they lingered at the door again, as if that space had become a threshold neither of them wanted to cross too quickly. This time, Kieran leaned in first, brushing a soft kiss against Indy's cheek, unhurried and full of intention. Indy closed her eyes, her smile slow and content. "This feels safe," she murmured. Kieran nodded. "That's what I want it to be." As the door closed behind Indy, Kieran didn't feel the familiar hollow quiet. She felt anchored, aware that something real was forming not through grand gestures, but through patience, presence, and choice. The shift from something tentative to something quietly intentional happened without either of them naming it. Kieran noticed it first in the smallest ways, how her apartment no longer felt like a place she merely occupied, but one she wanted to share moments in. Indy began coming over more often, not out of necessity but ease, slipping into Kieran's space as if invited by something unspoken rather than asked outright. One evening, rain pressed softly against the windows, turning the city into a blur of muted lights. Indy arrived carrying a worn sketchbook and an apologetic smile. "I needed a quiet place," she said. "My apartment has become a construction zone." Kieran took the sketchbook from her without comment, setting it on the table as if it belonged there. They cooked together again, slower this time, music playing low in the background. Indy showed Kieran how to loosen up, how to taste instead of measure, laughing when Kieran hesitated before trusting her instincts. At one point, Kieran reached across Indy to grab a spice, her arm brushing Indy's waist. The contact was brief, accidental, and yet neither moved away immediately. Their eyes met, something warm and steady passing between them. After dinner, Indy sat on the floor with her sketchbook, flipping through pages filled with ideas, unfinished concepts, and careful dreams. Kieran joined her without hesitation, legs stretched out beside Indy's, close enough that their knees touched. Indy explained her designs with enthusiasm, her voice softening when she spoke about wanting to create things that made people feel less alone. Kieran listened, truly listened, realizing how rare it was for her to sit without agenda, without distraction, simply present. "You already do that," Kieran said quietly. Indy looked up, surprised. "I do. For me," Kieran answered. The admission settled gently, honest and unguarded. Indy's fingers curled lightly into the fabric of Kieran's sleeve, grounding herself. The room felt smaller, warmer. This time, when they kissed, it wasn't tentative. It was still slow, still careful, but deeper, lingering just long enough to leave both of them breathing differently. When they pulled back, Indy rested her forehead against Kieran's shoulder, neither of them rushing to fill the silence. "I don't feel small with you," Indy murmured. Kieran closed her eyes, absorbing the weight of the words. "You never were," she replied. The rain continued outside, steady and unintrusive, as they stayed there together, connected by something growing stronger not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. The closeness they'd built began to change the texture of ordinary days. Kieran noticed how easily Indy fit into her life now, not as a presence that disrupted her routines, but one that softened them. Mornings started with shared coffee when schedules aligned, quiet exchanges that felt intimate without needing words. Indy would sit at the kitchen island, sketchbook open, occasionally glancing up to ask Kieran's opinion, not because she needed approval, but because she valued her perspective. Kieran found herself looking forward to those moments more than she cared to admit. One afternoon, Indy invited Kieran to visit her small studio apartment, hesitant but hopeful. "It's not much," she said, "but it's mine." Kieran accepted without question. The space was modest, filled with color swatches taped to the walls, prints leaning against furniture, sunlight filtering through thin curtains. It felt alive in a way Kieran's penthouse never had. Indy moved through the space with familiarity, showing her favorite corners, the desk where ideas were born late at night. Kieran watched, a quiet admiration settling in her chest. "You built this," she said softly. Indy shrugged, a little shy. "I'm still building." They sat together on the couch, knees touching, the closeness no longer tentative but intentional. Indy leaned her head against Kieran's shoulder, testing the comfort of it, and Kieran adjusted instinctively, wrapping an arm around her with gentle certainty. The contact felt grounding, right? They stayed like that for a long time, talking about nothing urgent, memories, small preferences, the way certain songs felt like places. When Indy finally looked up at her, her expression was open, unguarded. "I like who I am with you," she said quietly. Kieran felt the words settle deep, steadying. "I'm starting to like who I am too," she replied. The kiss that followed was unhurried and warm, a continuation rather than a beginning, filled with trust and mutual understanding. As evening settled, neither rushed to leave. They shared dinner, laughter soft and genuine, and when Kieran finally stood to go, the separation felt deliberate, chosen rather than forced. At the door, Indy squeezed her hand. "This feels real," she said. Kieran nodded, meeting her gaze. "It is." And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. What surprised them most was not how quickly their feelings deepened, but how naturally space for them appeared. They didn't rush into labels or grand declarations. Instead, they built something steadier, learning each other in layers. Kieran began adjusting her schedule without consciously deciding to, leaving work earlier some evenings, turning down late meetings she would once have accepted without hesitation. Indy noticed, not with expectation, but with quiet gratitude. One afternoon, they met in a small public park near Indy's apartment. Autumn leaves scattered across the ground, the air crisp but gentle. They sat on a bench, shoulders touching, watching dogs run past and families drift by. It felt strangely intimate to exist like this together, unremarkable and deeply connected. Indy traced absent circles on Kieran's palm, her touch light, exploratory. "I've never been good at staying," Indy admitted softly. "I move forward by instinct. When something feels uncertain, I usually leave before it can hurt." Kieran listened, her thumb brushing gently over Indy's knuckles. "I've always stayed," she replied, "even when it cost me things. Especially when it cost me things." Indy turned to her then, studying her face. "Does this scare you?" Kieran didn't answer immediately. She watched a leaf skitter across the pavement, then looked back at Indy. "Yes," she said honestly, "but not because of you. Because if I choose this, I can't hide behind work anymore." Indy absorbed that, her expression thoughtful. "I don't want to be something you fit in when it's convenient," she said. "I want to be chosen." The words landed carefully, not as a demand but a truth. Kieran met her gaze, without flinching. "You are," she said quietly. Indy's breath caught, emotion flickering across her face before she leaned in, resting her forehead against Kieran's. They didn't kiss this time. They stayed there, breathing together, letting the moment settle into something solid. When they eventually stood, Indy slipped her fingers through Kieran's, a simple, unspoken choice. They walked like that through the park, neither letting go, both aware that what they were building required intention, and that they were willing to give it. The intimacy they had built began to reveal itself not in grand gestures, but in how deeply it altered their inner worlds. Kieran noticed it first during a quiet Sunday morning when Indy stayed over late into the night, not sleeping together, not crossing any new physical line, just existing in the same space until time blurred. Indy had fallen asleep on the couch, curled beneath a blanket, her sketchbook resting open on her chest. Kieran stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, struck by how protective she felt without any sense of ownership. It wasn't desire that anchored her there. It was care. She adjusted the blanket gently, her fingers brushing Indy's shoulder with reverence rather than urgency, and went to her bedroom carrying a strange ache in her chest, something warm and frightening all at once. The next morning unfolded slowly. They cooked breakfast together, Indy barefoot and humming softly, Kieran leaning against the counter pretending to check her phone while actually watching the way Indy moved, relaxed and unguarded. It felt intimate in a way Kieran had never experienced, more exposing than any physical closeness she'd known before. "You're quiet," Indy observed, glancing over her shoulder. "Thinking," Kieran admitted. Indy smiled knowingly. "You do that a lot." After breakfast, they sat at the small dining table, coffee cooling between them, and for the first time, the conversation turned inward in a way neither could avoid. "Can I ask you something?" Indy said carefully. Kieran nodded. "What happens," Indy continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, "when this gets hard?" The question lingered. Kieran didn't deflect it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've avoided hard things by working through them, or around them. I've never stayed present through something that mattered this much." Indy met her gaze. "I don't need perfection," she said softly. "I just need honesty." The simplicity of the request undid Kieran more than any demand ever could. She took a slow breath. "Then here's the truth," she said. "I'm scared I'll disappoint you, that you'll see all the ways I'm emotionally inexperienced and decide I'm not worth the effort." Indy's expression softened. She reached across the table, covering Kieran's hand. "I already see you," she said, "and I'm still here." The words settled deep, reshaping something fundamental inside Kieran. That afternoon, they left the apartment together, walking without destination, hands brushing occasionally, neither quite ready to lace fingers again but not pulling away either. They wandered through a bookstore, Indy lingering over design magazines, Kieran reading passages aloud she thought Indy might like. At one point, Indy laughed quietly. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said. "At what?" "Being with someone," Indy replied. Kieran smiled faintly. "Only with you." The honesty felt natural now, less terrifying each time it surfaced. As evening approached, they returned to Indy's apartment, where the air felt more charged, more aware. Indy turned on soft music, moving around the kitchen, while Kieran sat at the table watching her, struck again by how easily admiration slipped into affection. Indy noticed the look. "What?" she asked. Kieran stood, closing the distance between them slowly, deliberately, giving Indy every opportunity to step back. She didn't. "I was just thinking," Kieran said quietly, "how much I want to do this right." Indy's breath hitched slightly. "Then stay," she said. "Not tonight. Not physically. Just emotionally." Kieran nodded, her forehead resting gently against Indy's. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, the closeness intimate without being overt. When they finally kissed, it was tender and unhurried, deepened by trust rather than urgency. Indy's hands rested lightly at Kieran's waist, grounding her. Kieran's hands cupped Indy's face with care, as if holding something precious. When they parted, both were smiling softly, eyes bright with feeling. Later, as Kieran prepared to leave, the separation felt heavier than before, not because of longing alone, but because of attachment. At the door, Indy hesitated, then spoke. "I'm not afraid of falling," she said quietly. "I'm afraid of falling alone." Kieran took her hands, steady and sure. "You won't," she replied. "Not if I have any say in it." As Kieran walked back into the night, the city no longer felt distant or cold. It felt like a place she was finally living in, not just moving through. The awareness of what they were building settled into both of them with a quiet gravity that changed how they moved through the world. Kieran noticed it in the way she began to anticipate Indy's reactions before they happened, in how certain thoughts now instinctively oriented toward her. Indy felt it too, a steady pull that wasn't overwhelming but constant, like something reliable she could lean into without losing herself. They began to create small traditions without naming them as such. Tuesday evenings became their unspoken time, neither scheduling over it, both showing up naturally. Sometimes they cooked. Sometimes they sat on opposite ends of the couch, legs tangled, reading their own books in comfortable silence. One evening, Indy brought over a simple board game she'd loved as a kid, laughing when Kieran admitted she had never played anything without a strategic goal. "You don't have to win," Indy teased gently. "You just have to be here." Kieran lost on purpose halfway through, realizing too late that she actually wanted Indy to win, wanted to see that satisfied smile spread across her face. The realization startled her, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt so right. Another night, Kieran invited Indy to attend a small, informal dinner she hosted for a few colleagues at her penthouse. Nothing formal, nothing performative. Indy hesitated at first, aware of the different worlds brushing against each other again, but Kieran reassured her. "You don't have to be anything for anyone," she said. "Just be with me." Throughout the evening, Kieran stayed close, not possessive, but present. Indy noticed how Kieran's hand found the small of her back when conversations grew crowded, how her gaze returned to Indy instinctively, checking in. Later, after everyone left, Indy leaned against the counter, watching Kieran rinse glasses. "You were different tonight," Indy said softly. Kieran glanced at her.
"How?"
"Lighter," Indy replied. "Like you weren't holding your breath." Kieran smiled faintly. "I didn't realize I had been." The admission felt intimate, unguarded. They talked late into the night then, sitting on the floor again, backs against the cabinets where everything had begun. Indy traced invisible shapes on the tile, thoughtful. "I keep waiting for the moment this starts to feel unequal," she confessed. "For the other shoe to drop." Kieran turned toward her fully. "If it ever does," she said carefully, "we talk about it. We don't let it grow in silence." Indy studied her, searching for cracks. Finding none, she leaned closer, resting her head against Kieran's shoulder. "I trust you," she said quietly, surprising them both with the simplicity of the words.
Trust.
Kieran felt it settle heavily and beautifully in her chest. She wrapped an arm around Indy, holding her without urgency, without expectation. The kiss that followed later was slower than before, deeper, carrying with it the weight of choice and reassurance. When Indy eventually fell asleep against her, Kieran stayed awake longer than usual, not restless, just present, memorizing the feeling of being needed not for what she provided, but for who she was. The next morning, Indy woke first and found Kieran already awake, watching her. "That's unsettling," Indy murmured, amused. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough to know I don't want this to be temporary," Kieran replied without hesitation. The words hung between them, unpressured but undeniable. Indy's expression softened, emotion flickering across her face. "Then don't make it temporary," she said. They didn't define anything that morning. They didn't need to. What they had was already taking shape through presence, through consistency, through the steady decision to stay. The realization that what they shared was no longer fragile, but forming into something resilient arrived quietly, without ceremony. It showed itself in how easily they began to rely on one another, not out of need, but preference. Kieran noticed she started planning her days with Indy in mind, not rearranging her life for her, but integrating her presence as something essential rather than optional. Indy, in turn, found herself carrying a calm confidence she hadn't had before, a steady assurance that came from being chosen consistently, not dramatically. One evening, Indy invited Kieran to attend a small local exhibition where a few of her design pieces were being displayed as part of a student showcase. It wasn't glamorous, just a modest gallery space filled with friends, classmates, and quiet pride. Indy hesitated before asking, worrying it might feel like pressure or imbalance, but Kieran agreed immediately. "I want to see your world," she said simply. At the gallery, Indy stayed close to Kieran at first, fingers brushing her sleeve occasionally as if grounding herself. Kieran moved through the space attentively, asking questions about Indy's work with genuine curiosity, listening as Indy explained her process, her inspiration, her doubts. She watched as others praised Indy's designs, saw the way Indy tried to deflect compliments, and gently countered it by meeting her eyes and saying, "They're right." The words meant more coming from Kieran than any applause. Later, when the crowd thinned, they stepped outside into the cool night air, standing beneath a street lamp that cast soft light over them. Indy exhaled deeply. "I was scared you'd think it was small," she admitted. Kieran shook her head. "I think it's brave," she said. "You're building something that reflects who you are. That matters." Indy smiled, emotion bright in her eyes. The walk home was slow, deliberate. When they reached Kieran's apartment, they didn't rush inside. They stood together in the elevator, shoulders brushing, the quiet thick with meaning. Inside, the evening unfolded without urgency. They made tea, sat close on the couch, Indy's legs tucked beneath her, Kieran's arm resting along the back, not touching but aware. The conversation turned reflective, the kind that emerges only when trust has settled in. "Do you ever miss who you were before all of this?" Indy asked softly. Kieran considered the question. "I miss parts of her," she admitted. "But I don't miss being closed off." Indy nodded. "I don't miss wondering if I'm invisible," she said. The honesty between them felt like a shared exhale. Slowly, deliberately, Kieran shifted closer, her hand finding Indy's. This time, Indy laced their fingers together without hesitation. The kiss that followed was deeper than any before, still unhurried, but charged with certainty. It wasn't exploratory anymore. It was affirming, a quiet acknowledgement of something already chosen. When they pulled apart, Indy rested her forehead against Kieran's chest, listening to her heartbeat. "I feel safe with you," Indy said softly. The words carried weight. Kieran wrapped her arms around Indy fully then, holding her close, feeling the truth of it settle deep. "I will always protect that," she replied. They stayed like that for a long time, the city beyond the windows distant and irrelevant. Later, when Indy eventually fell asleep curled against her, Kieran remained awake, not restless, but thoughtful. She realized that love, at least this kind, wasn't something that arrived all at once. It was built moment by moment, through showing up, through choosing tenderness over fear. And for the first time in her life, Kieran knew she wasn't just capable of love, she was already living it. The days following felt fuller, weighted with meaning rather than uncertainty. What had once been tentative now carried a quiet confidence, not loud or performative, but steady enough to be trusted. Kieran noticed how Indy no longer hesitated before reaching for her hand, how the instinct to close distance had become natural, unremarkable, and yet endlessly profound. They weren't pretending nothing had changed. They were simply allowing the change to exist without rushing to define it. One afternoon, Kieran invited Indy to spend the day with her away from the city. No agenda, no itinerary, just space. They drove north, the skyline fading into trees and open sky, Indy resting her elbow against the window, watching the world pass with a soft, thoughtful smile. Kieran kept glancing over, struck by how deeply comfortable the silence between them had become. They stopped near the water, a quiet stretch of shore where the sound of waves replaced the city's constant hum. Indy kicked off her shoes, walking closer to the edge, toes brushing cold sand. Kieran followed, slower, more deliberate. Indy turned back toward her, eyes bright. I forget sometimes, she said, how much I need places like this. Kieran nodded. I forget how much I avoided them. They walked along the shoreline, close enough that their arms brushed, conversations drifting from memories to small hopes. Indy spoke about wanting her work to matter beyond aesthetics, about designing things that made people feel anchored. Kieran listened, admiring the clarity Indy carried even when she doubted herself. You're already doing that, Kieran said softly. Indy smiled, but this time she didn't deflect it. She accepted the words, letting them settle. They found a quiet spot farther down, sitting side by side on a smooth stretch of rock, the water stretching endlessly in front of them. The wind picked up, and without thinking, Kieran draped her jacket over Indy's shoulders. Indy leaned into her, resting her head against Kieran's shoulder, the contact easy, unforced. Can I tell you something? Indy asked quietly. Kieran turned slightly, attentive. Anything. Indy hesitated, then spoke. I've spent so much of my life proving I'm enough. Enough on my own. Enough without help. Being with you makes me realize I don't have to stop being independent to let someone care about me. The vulnerability in her voice tightened something in Kieran's chest. She wrapped an arm around Indy, holding her closer. You never stopped being enough, she said firmly. You just didn't have anyone willing to stand beside you instead of in front of you. Indy swallowed, emotion flickering across her face. She tilted her head up, their eyes meeting in a quiet, intimate moment that felt suspended in time. The kiss that followed was slow and grounding, carrying with it gratitude and choice rather than urgency. When they parted, Indy stayed close, fingers tracing small, absent patterns against Kieran's sleeve. They stayed there longer than planned, letting the day stretch without interruption. On the drive back, Indy dozed lightly, head resting against Kieran's shoulder when they stopped at a long light, her trust evident in the ease of it. Kieran felt something shift then. Not fear, not doubt, but a deep sense of responsibility she welcomed rather than resisted. That evening, back at the apartment, the comfort between them carried into the smallest gestures. Cooking together, brushing past one another, sharing quiet laughter that didn't need explanation. At one point, Indy paused, leaning against the counter, watching Kieran move through the kitchen. You know, she said softly, I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore. Kieran turned to her, curious. Waiting for what? For the moment this disappears, Indy replied honestly. Kieran crossed the space between them, resting her hands at Indy's waist, not possessive, just present. It won't, she said. Not because things never end, but because I won't walk away without trying. Indy's breath hitched slightly, her hands settling over Kieran's wrists. That's all I ever wanted, she murmured. They stood there, close and quiet, the city humming faintly beyond the windows, both aware that what they were building wasn't fragile anymore. It was deliberate. It was chosen. And it was theirs. The depth of what they shared began to ask for a different kind of honesty, one that lived not in confessions alone but in decisions. Kieran felt it first in the way she caught herself imagining futures that naturally included Indy, not as a dramatic leap, but as a quiet assumption. Indy noticed it too, in how Kieran's attention lingered, how her presence felt rooted rather than provisional. It was Indy who finally named the shift, one evening as they sat on the couch, legs folded toward each other, the room lit softly by the city beyond the windows. We've been careful, Indy said gently. Not avoiding, just intentional. I don't want to rush us. But I also don't want to pretend we're still circling. Kieran listened, heart steady, fear present but no longer in control. What are you asking for? She asked, not defensively but openly. Indy met her gaze.
Clarity, she said.
Not promises. Just the truth about where you are. Kieran took a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I'm here, she said. Fully. I don't want to hedge anymore. The words felt like a door opening. Indy's shoulders relaxed, relief visible. They didn't rush into declarations. Instead, they talked about expectations, about how they each handled conflict, about the kinds of fears that didn't announce themselves until they were already shaping behavior. Indy admitted She tended to withdraw when overwhelmed, mistaking space for safety. Kieran confessed she defaulted to fixing rather than listening, a habit born from years of control. They made room for these truths without trying to solve them immediately. The conversations stretched into the night, punctuated by soft laughter, by pauses that felt intimate rather than heavy. At one point, Indy reached out, resting her palm over Kieran's heart. "I want to be with you," she said simply. Kieran covered Indy's hand with her own. "I want to be chosen by you," she replied, the echo intentional. The kiss that followed carried a new weight, not urgency, but commitment. It was deeper, slower, infused with the knowledge that neither was guessing anymore. When they pulled back, they stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing aligned. Later, they moved to the bedroom together for the first time without hesitation, not crossing into anything hurried or performative, but allowing closeness to exist naturally. They lay side by side, fully clothed, talking in the dark about small memories that felt suddenly important, favorite childhood smells, songs that felt like home, moments that shaped them quietly. Indy traced circles on Kieran's arm, grounding herself in the reality of being there. "This feels different," Indy murmured. "It feels chosen." Kieran turned toward her, the darkness making honesty easier. "It is," she said. "I choose you." The simplicity of it carried everything. Morning came softly. They woke tangled together, the comfort undeniable. There was no awkwardness, no retreat. They moved through the apartment with an ease that felt earned, brushing teeth side by side, sharing glances that carried meaning. Over breakfast, Indy smiled at Kieran with an openness that made her chest ache. "I'm glad we didn't rush," Indy said. "I'm glad we didn't hide." Kieran reached across the table, lacing their fingers together. "Me too," she said. "This feels like the beginning, not the middle." When Indy left later that day, it wasn't with the heaviness of separation. It was with the certainty of return. Kieran stood by the window after the door closed, not waiting, not wondering, but grounded in the knowledge that what they had chosen was no longer tentative. It was mutual. It was intentional.
And it was real.
The shift from choosing each other to living inside that choice brought with it a new kind of vulnerability, quieter but deeper. It wasn't about fear of loss anymore. It was about the courage required to let love become ordinary. Kieran felt it most acutely in the mornings, waking beside Indy with sunlight filtering through the curtains, realizing that this closeness was no longer an exception. It was becoming a rhythm. Indy noticed it too, in the way Kieran's presence no longer felt carefully curated, but instinctive. They began to leave small traces of each other everywhere. Indy's sweater draped over the back of a chair. Kieran's favorite mug sitting on Indy's counter. Notes appeared again, not just cheerful reminders, but quiet affirmations left where the other would find them unexpectedly. One morning, Indy taped a note beside Kieran's laptop that simply read, "I see you trying." It stayed there for days. That afternoon, Kieran canceled a late meeting without explanation, something she had never done before. Instead, she picked Indy up from class, waiting outside the building with a patience that surprised even her. Indy spotted her from the steps and smiled in a way that felt unguarded, free. "You didn't have to," Indy said as she slid into the passenger seat. "I wanted to," Kieran replied, and meant more than the ride. They drove without destination, windows down, music low, conversation drifting easily. Indy spoke about a freelance opportunity she was considering, her uncertainty evident. Kieran listened carefully, resisting the urge to offer solutions, choosing instead to ask what Indy wanted. "I want to feel proud," Indy admitted. "Not just capable. Proud." Kieran nodded. "Then let's make sure whatever you choose moves you toward that." The word "let" settled between them, inclusive and deliberate. That evening, they cooked together again, but this time the intimacy carried a different weight. There was less hesitation, more trust. Kieran stood behind Indy at the stove, her hands resting lightly at Indy's hips, not demanding, just present. Indy leaned back instinctively, comfortable, anchored. The kiss that followed was slow but unmistakably intimate, deepened by familiarity rather than novelty. They moved together toward the bedroom without words, guided by a shared understanding rather than impulse. What followed was not rushed or performative, but tender and attentive, built on listening and trust. When they lay together afterward, Indy's head resting on Kieran's chest, the room quiet around them, Indy traced slow patterns against Kieran's skin. "I don't feel like I'm proving anything anymore," Indy said softly. Kieran closed her eyes, the weight of the words settling deeply. "You never had to," she replied. "I just needed time to learn how to show up." Indy smiled, lifting her head slightly to meet Kieran's gaze. "You are," she said simply. In the days that followed, that truth echoed. They navigated minor misunderstandings without retreat, choosing conversation over silence. When Indy pulled inward one evening, overwhelmed by deadlines, Kieran didn't push. She stayed nearby, present without pressure. When Kieran grew quiet after a long day, Indy didn't assume distance meant disinterest. She reached for her hand instead. Slowly, deliberately, they were learning each other's languages. One night, as they lay together watching the city lights flicker beyond the window, Indy spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I used to think love was something that arrived fully formed," she said. "Like a moment you could point to and say, there, that's it." Kieran turned toward her. "And now?" Indy smiled softly. "Now I think it's something you build by choosing the same person every day, even when it's quiet." Kieran felt emotion rise, steady and grounding rather than overwhelming. She brushed a strand of hair from Indy's face. "Then I'm glad it's quiet," she said. "It means we're listening." They fell asleep like that, bodies aligned, breathing slow and matched, the comfort between them no longer tentative. Not fragile, but lived in. What surprised them most as the weeks continued was not the absence of conflict, but the way love reshaped it. There were disagreements now, small, ordinary ones, but they unfolded without the sharp edges either of them had once feared. The romance between them no longer lived only in charged moments or tender silences. It lived in negotiation, in patience, in learning how to stay present when comfort was easier than courage. Kieran noticed how instinctively she began to adjust, not compromising herself, but expanding. Indy noticed too, in the way Kieran no longer approached emotional moments as problems to solve, but as spaces to share. One evening, Indy arrived at the penthouse later than planned, shoulders tight, thoughts visibly tangled. She dropped her bag by the door and stood there for a moment, breathing, unsure how to step forward. Kieran didn't ask questions immediately. She crossed the room, took Indy's coat gently, and pulled her into a quiet embrace, steady and grounding. Indy melted into it with a soft exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I'm overwhelmed," she admitted after a moment. "Not because of us. Because everything else." Kieran nodded, her chin resting lightly against Indy's hair. "Then let me be the place you don't have to manage right now," she said. The words loosened something deep inside Indy. They moved to the couch together, Indy curled against Kieran, fingers tracing the familiar line of her arm. Indy spoke slowly, carefully, about pressure she felt to succeed quickly, about the fear that slowing down to love might mean falling behind. Kieran listened without interruption, her hand moving in slow circles along Indy's back. "Loving you doesn't take anything away from who you're becoming," Kieran said quietly when Indy finished. "It adds to it. And if it ever feels like it doesn't, we talk. We don't disappear." Indy tilted her head up, studying Kieran's face. "You really mean that?" "I do," Kieran replied without hesitation. The certainty in her voice felt like an anchor. That night, their intimacy was unhurried and deeply attuned, shaped by trust rather than need. There was laughter between kisses, whispered reassurance between touches, a sense that being close no longer required permission or performance. Later, lying together in the dark, Indy rested her hand over Kieran's heart, feeling its steady rhythm. "You're different when you let yourself feel," Indy murmured. Kieran smiled faintly. "So are you." The days that followed carried that same tone, gentle, connected, alive. Kieran began spending more time in Indy's apartment, appreciating its lived-in warmth, the creative chaos that reflected Indy's inner world. Indy, in turn, grew comfortable inhabiting Kieran's space without shrinking herself, rearranging small things, adding color, making it theirs rather than borrowed. One afternoon, while working side by side at the kitchen table, Indy paused, looking thoughtful. "Do you ever worry we're too comfortable?" she asked. Kieran looked up from her laptop. "Comfort doesn't mean complacency," she said after a moment. "It means safety. Growth still happens inside it." Indy considered that, then smiled. "I like the way you think." That evening, as dusk settled, they stood together by the window, arms wrapped loosely around each other, watching the city shift into night. Indy leaned back against Kieran's chest, fitting there naturally. "I don't feel like I'm waiting for something to go wrong anymore," Indy said softly. "I feel it here." Kieran kissed her temple, emotion steady and warm. "Me too," she replied. "This isn't something I'm holding carefully, so it doesn't break. It's something I'm building so it lasts." Indy turned in her arms, meeting her gaze. "Then let's keep building," she said. Kieran smiled, her answer immediate. Together. They sealed the promise not with drama, but with closeness, foreheads touching, breaths shared, the quiet certainty of two women choosing love not as an escape, but as a place to stand. The certainty they had been building did not arrive with fireworks or sweeping declarations. It arrived the way all lasting things do, quietly, firmly, without asking permission to stay. Kieran noticed it one morning when she woke before Indy and didn't feel the old instinct to retreat inward. Instead, she lay still, watching Indy sleep beside her, noticing the calm rise and fall of her breathing, the way her hand rested easily against Kieran's arm as if it had always belonged there. There was no fear in the moment, no calculation, just presence. Indy stirred slowly, blinking awake, her gaze finding Kieran's with a softness that made something steady settle deep in Kieran's chest. "You're thinking again," Indy murmured, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I am," Kieran admitted, "but not in the way I used to." Indy shifted closer, resting her head against Kieran's shoulder. "Good," she said quietly. They stayed like that for a while, unhurried, until the morning demanded their attention. The day unfolded gently. They made breakfast together, moving around the kitchen with the ease of people who no longer questioned their place beside one another. Indy worked on her laptop at the table while Kieran answered emails nearby, their occasional glances carrying more meaning than words ever could. At one point, Indy looked up suddenly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Kieran nodded immediately. "Anything." Indy hesitated, then spoke. "When did you know this wasn't temporary?" Kieran didn't answer right away. She considered the question carefully, not because she doubted the answer, but because she wanted to honor it. "When I stopped wondering what would happen if you left," she said finally, "and started caring more about how we grow if you stay." Indy absorbed that, emotion flickering across her face. "I think," she said softly, "I knew when I stopped bracing myself." The honesty between them felt complete, unguarded. Later that afternoon, they walked through the city together, hands loosely intertwined, not performing closeness, but inhabiting it. They stopped at a small cafe Indy loved, shared pastries, laughed about nothing in particular. It struck Kieran then how different this happiness felt from anything she'd known before. It wasn't sharp or overwhelming. It didn't demand constant attention. It simply existed, steady and warm. That evening, back at the penthouse, Indy stood by the window, watching the lights come on across the city. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this place used to feel intimidating to me." Kieran joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "And now?" Indy leaned into her. "Now it feels like somewhere I belong." The words settled like a promise. Kieran turned Indy toward her, her expression open and sure. "You do," she said. "Not because I want you to fit into my life, but because I want to build one with you." Indy's breath caught, not in surprise, but in recognition. She reached up, cupping Kieran's face, her touch reverent and certain. "Then I'm here," Indy said. Not as something fragile. Not as something borrowed. I'm here because I choose you. The kiss they shared then was unhurried and full, carrying everything they had built together: patience, trust, affection, and a love that no longer needed to prove itself. Later, as night settled around them, they lay together in quiet companionship, talking about small plans and unspoken hopes, not mapping out a future in rigid detail, but trusting that it would unfold as long as they continued choosing each other. Kieran realized then that love hadn't arrived to rescue her from loneliness. It had met her where she was and invited her to stay open. Indy realized she hadn't been lifted into someone else's world. She had been welcomed as herself. As sleep finally claimed them, the city outside hummed on, indifferent and distant, while inside the penthouse something rare and deeply human rested in certainty, not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. And that was more than either of them had ever dared to hope for. If you enjoyed this content and want to support the channel in a special way, try clicking the thanks button below. It's the one with the heart and $sign icon. With super thanks, you can make a direct contribution to the channel, which helps me keep creating awesome videos for you.